Paul, we're seeing, I don't know, you're still muted, Paul, and we're seeing a couple of different pictures overlaid on.
Okay, did I get the screen share in front of you? And
We
did I
have
get it?
Yes,
pictures of you and Rena.
Well, how about
There
that?
you go. There you go. Can you make it a little bigger?
Think so?
There you go.
Okay, whoop, I got too far there. All right. Now then, I should have John Mueller in front of you. Not quite so gray as he commonly appears today, but there you get to see him as a younger man. And I have the thumbs up on audio
Yep.
and visual. Okay.
Yep.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my friends and brothers and sisters on the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. It is such a pleasure to be able to welcome you, and this evening, especially to be able to introduce you to John Mueller, who comes to us from a Lutheran RLDS home in California. He became a guide at the Kirtland Temple. He went into military service as a conscientious objector, as a medic. That would be the Vietnam War. And he got degrees in chemistry and nursing, and married Maggie, who is a librarian for many years, married her in 72. And so they've got 50 years of marriage as their pot of gold. He's had a stint at Harvest Hills, which was that community he spoke of last week, which was designed with Zion in mind. And he spent a lifetime of service helping Kansas City poor. I have been amazed at the number of times that he's reported on some impoverished person dropping by or calling and needing help. And John has been one of those people that they could call upon and get assistance immediately, if not sooner. He's someone who likes to work with his hands. And so his presentation this evening on the High Priest arises from his attempt to put pieces of the puzzle together. And so we're getting the benefit of his investigation, because there are some interesting puzzles relative to the High Priest in the Restoration Movement and beyond. And so I've had a chance to preview, and I think you'll find his presentation thought-provoking, perhaps a bit challenging, and certainly the kind of thing that will stimulate the common question and answers that we commonly have. Well, let us pray. Wonderful Creator, whose unsurpassed majesty can only be glimpsed by the human eye, we look upon your multiverse of galaxies and see our awesome Milky Way, and we look at ourselves and wonder why. Why do you create mankind and give us the chance to not be kind at all? Why do you care for us enough to pick us up when we fall? Why in the scriptures do you encourage us to pay attention to those among us considered to be the least? And why do you, or is it just we, who position some we call the high priest? When you encourage us to believe in the worth of all persons and that all are called, why do we find a mix of the apathetic, the mean ones, and the enthralled? Dear Lord, our questions lead us into margins of understanding, sometimes into danger with your everlasting might. So this evening, we ask you to bless our speaker, John Mueller, as he shares his insight, and our participants as we Zoom, attempting to see eye to eye, that we can each gain some understanding, that in our quest to please you, understandings that we can apply. And this we ask in the name of the Christ, who for us was willing to die and be raised again for eternity. Amen. All right, John, it's your turn to share the screen or address the body, and the floor is yours. Thank you for coming and sharing with us.
Where's he at?
We have the video. We're missing the audio, John.
Should have me now.
There we have you.
My computer decided to reboot while you were in the middle of your prayer.
Well, prayer is a good opportunity for us to reboot.
That's so true. I have put this slide presentation together to summarize more or less or condense a paper that I have written in the last year as I've been studying the question of is there a high priest in the restoration, and what is it supposed to do? Now, I use the word necessary to emphasize what I think is the importance. Now, on every slide, I put a number in the bottom right corner. So if you have questions or want to refer back to a slide later on, feel free to. The Bible describes a restricted but focused ministerial role for the high priest. Basically judging, offering sacrifices for sin. After the New Testament, you can see we have only certain officers, and some others that aren't in the New Testament, but the high priest isn't there. And so I wondered why. And therefore, I have two questions that I'm asking tonight, and I think I'll present answers for them. First one, why does the community of Christ and its predecessors center the office of high priest as fundamental to all Melchizedek priesthood functions? And second question is, what should the ministry of the high priest be focused on today? So I studied, for a year and a half, I was a student at a seminary. So they talk to you about how to look at the meaning of all the words in the original language and how they've been translated into various times in the Bible into other words, so you can get an idea as to what the original text meant. And so this slide, and occasionally some other slides, looks at that. We can see the word priest showing up about 500 times, almost always the word Cohen, which, if I'm not mistaken, is also a name of a family of priests. And you can see how it's translated, officiating as a priest or as a prince or a principal officer. The phrase, the high priest, shows up 16 times, and almost always this is naming specific people. And the priesthood word comes from another Hebrew word. And don't ask me to say these words correctly. I am not a scholar of Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Chaldean, or anything else. But it's translated as priesthood or priest's office. And interestingly enough, the phrase high priesthood does not occur. But we're going to look at three specifically named priests. First one we're looking at briefly on this slide is Melchizedek. And in Genesis 14:18, we find him as the priest of God Most High in the city of Salem. And Abraham made sacrifices there and was blessed by Melchizedek after winning a battle. And we know the word Salem or the location Salem is commonly thought to be today's Jerusalem. But the Hebrew name can be translated as place of peace or feel the wholeness, which is very interesting. Now, I will not try to say how we're supposed to spell the name as Melchizedek, because it has about 4 different ways it's spelled, depending on whose version of scriptures you're looking at and so forth. And I won't even guarantee that I have consistently spelled in this slide presentation. So for this, forgive me. But anyway, that's basically what we see in the Old Testament is right there from Melchizedek. We find Potiphar, the priest of the Egyptian god On, who became a father-in-law to Joseph after Joseph was elevated to the high office as number 2 to Pharaoh. We find Jethro. He's not described as a high priest, but as the priest of Midian. And Moses married his daughter, which doesn't surprise me, being out in the wilderness after Moses was exiled. And there were some very pretty girls there. You can't blame Moses for falling in love with one of them as God put the two together. Now, the Bible doesn't identify the deity to whom Jethro was a priest, but everything he did suggests that there was a strong acknowledgement and worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, you may remember the story in the Bible about Balaam, the priest of Midian, and Balak, the king of the Moabites. I wouldn't be surprised if Jethro and Balaam had some connection because they were basically only about 40 years apart. And certainly Balaam did worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but this didn't keep him from getting killed by the Israelites, as you find in Numbers 31, verse 8, because he had given Balak, the king of the Moabites, advice on how to lead the Israelites into sin. Now, except for the above named people in the Old Testament, all the other references pretty much are describing a sacrificial or judicial role within the authority given by Moses to Aaron and his children, who were of the tribe of Levi, or in other words, Levites. And this role continued all the way down to the Roman rule and the end of the Old Testament. And the high priest was the one who presided in the roles for the annual sacrifice for sin in the temple on the Day of Atonement, or otherwise known as Yom Kippur. The role of the high priest was an Aaronic priesthood role. And priests were sufficient for all the other types of sacrifices and offerings. The book Antiquities is a very interesting book, and I would recommend it to you to read sometime. And it gives an extremely expanded history of the whole era of high priests from the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, and Moses on down to the time, his own time in the Romans. And he also gives a very interesting and detailed history of life of Moses as well. But we've mentioned sacrifice, so we'll look at that for a moment. The Old Testament has a number of words translated as sacrifice. At least 280 are from the Hebrew zabach or zabach, which also is often translated as kill or offering or offerings or offer and so forth. There are a few other words also that are translated either from Chaldean or the Hebrew word korban and is similar, and shag. And there's also a root asa, which has many meanings, but generally means to do or to make. But in all of these, sacrifice is a ritualistic or worshipful act. Now, throughout all this, there was no such thing as human sacrifice. We don't find that used in reference. We don't find any of those above words used in reference to human sacrifice. There are two unrelated Hebrew words that are used to denote killing with the intent of destruction, murder, or slaying. Some people might argue, well, didn't Abraham sacrifice Isaac? And as we think back a little more carefully, no, he was ready to. And then it was a test of obedience as shown by the result. And then in 1 Kings 18, we have the killing of 450 prophets of Baal after the miraculous sacrifice on Mount Carmel. Well, remember, Elijah remained on the mount. The prophets were killed in a valley after that sacrifice. So the sacrifice that Elijah had officiated in with a fire falling down from heaven was not a human sacrifice. If you're ready, we're going to go on to the Book of Mormon. It contains histories of three peoples from the biblical Old Testament times. You have the people of Jared, fleeing from the destruction of the Tower of Babel about 2000, and I use BCE instead of BC as before the Christian or before the Common Era is what that actually means. That's a deference to the Jewish people. We have the families of Lehi and also the people of Mueller all leaving around just before or just after the destruction of the temple. The Book of Mormon contains records from all three, but we'll focus on the descendants of Lehi. The Book of Ether, which contains the records of the Jaredites, does not mention the high priest, although it has a number of references to Enoch, but nothing beyond Enoch. And there were a whole lot of wars in the Book of Ether. And how do these various words occur in the Book of Mormon? You find priests mentioned 80 times, alongside teachers, lawyers, others, and so forth. And here we have priests who did good and did evil, both. We have high priests 26 times, high priesthood 8 times, sacrifice mentioned 21 times. We go to the Book of Alma, starting around chapter 228 in the RLDS version. In these scripture references, I'm putting the LDS versions in square brackets so you can follow along or double check your own versions as necessary. Anyway, we have 228 or 429. Alma confined himself wholly to the high priesthood of the holy order of God, to the testimony of the word according to the spirit of revelation and prophecy. Moving forward in 969, we have, and verses that follow, we have this ministry as eternal, identified with Melchizedek, and it emphasizes teaching. Alma chapter 10, which in the LDS is chapters 13 through 14, has a much greater description of Melchizedek in his ministry than we find anywhere in the Old Testament, identifying it as eternal, without beginning or end of days, and it is associated with the Son of God, also identified as Christ. Human sacrifice is described in the Book of Mormon, but only in Mormon chapter 2 or chapter 4. However, we have lots of wars led by evil religious leaders. And now if we look in Alma 16 or 34, we see Amulek preaching about the coming of Christ and how he will offer his life as notice the quote I'm putting in here, the great and last sacrifice for sin. And if we move forward in years to 3rd Nephi, chapter 4 or chapter 9, you will see these words, and ye shall offer up unto me no more the shedding of blood, yea, your sacrifices and your burnt offerings shall be done away, for I will accept none of your sacrifices and your burnt offerings, and ye shall offer for a sacrifice unto me a broken heart and a contrite spirit. Now, those phrases show up 7 times in the Book of Mormon, 2 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. The Bible only has broken-hearted twice, contrite spirit 3 times, contrite heart once, but these are never together as you find here in the Book of Mormon or in the Doctrine and Covenants. And I think that's important. If you can move with me now, I hope you are forgiving me if I'm going too quickly through the Book of Mormon. But if you can bear with me, we're now going into the New Testament. And we see the terms priest, high priest, and chief priest occurring in various forms a number of times with a couple Greek roots. We have other Greek words that mean the office of the priesthood, the priest's office or priesthood. Sacrifice occurs along with its plural and past tense about 40 times. And the original Greek is referring to the act or the victim. A few times, the more primitive thuo is translated as sacrifice or slay or kill. But you notice carefully a very different word, and I won't try to pronounce it. Somebody who's Greek can do so, is used to mean sacrifice as an offering to idols. The entire New Testament discussion of priests, high priests, and sacrifices all refers to the priest's roles within the existing Jewish religious and civil life in Israel. But there are exceptions. Look at Romans chapter 12, verse 1. And I'm quoting here from the, the New Revised Standard Version. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And this is echoed in 1 Peter 2:5, which says, you also are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. We look at the book of Hebrews, we come into what can be described as a very carefully constructed essay that presents Jesus as a Melchizedek and not as an Aaronic high priest. And it acknowledges many times, or at least a couple times, that Jesus in chapter 7, verse 13 to 14, that Jesus was not from the tribe of Judah and had no Levitical priesthood authority. So he had to be named as a high priest from an earlier, more ancient authority. And that's how the book of Hebrews does that, combining verses from Psalms 2:7 and 110:4 to present Jesus as the Son of God and a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And that's what we have right out of those two Psalms. And that goes back to Genesis 14:18. Chapters 6 to 10 make it clear that this is for all people and all time, that sacrifice as a new covenant. But notice that he is listed here, he is not named here as the last high priest, just the great high priest. So there seems to be some agreement between the various texts that we've looked at so far. The Aaronic priesthood order, priestly role has ended. The high priest no longer is needed to make an annual sacrifice for sins. It's convenient. The temple was destroyed. Jesus has often an eternal one-time sacrifice of his blood for all time. So that leaves us still with a question. Why does the restoration still have the office of high priest? And I'm suspecting that this has something to maybe do with the passages we looked at 3rd Nephi, Romans, or 1 Peter. So let's look a little further. Let's move to the Doctrine and Covenants. It contains the word of God to the church, founded under Joseph Smith, starting in the 1820s and on to the present time. In it, the phrases high priest and high priesthood are mentioned over 130 times. And in harmony with the description in Hebrews 7:11 through 18, there are two orders of priesthood, the lesser or Aaronic priesthood and the greater or Melchizedek. And you can see in Doctrine and Covenants 83, 3BC, or 84:19 to 22, which was given in 1832. And this greater priesthood administereth the gospel and holdeth the keys of the ministry, the key of the mysteries of the kingdom, even the key of the knowledge of God. Therefore, in the ordinances thereof, the power of godliness is manifest, for without this no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. And you might think back that no man can see that God in the face, in the flesh, and live. And that makes some interesting thought, doesn't it? We can move on to section 104 or 107, given in 1835. And we find the power and authority of the higher or Melchizedek priesthood is, and here I put this as bullet points, but the text doesn't have bullet points in the Doctrine and Covenants. Hold the keys of all the spiritual blessings of the church. Excuse me. To have the privilege of receiving the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, to have the heavens opened unto them, to commune with the general assembly and church of the firstborn, and to enjoy the communion and presence of God the Father and Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant. Now, there you have something that the Old Testament seems to say you're not supposed to be able to do. And I would say, wow. But I think we also have an answer to our first question. Why do we find the office of high priest within the Restoration movement started through Joseph Smith? And I'd say the answer is the office of Melchizedek high priest has always been in God's plan for ministry. God has this office in the Restoration Church now. The early saints read of this ministry in the newly printed Book of Mormon and asked about it. And the revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants were the answers to their questions. Now, so far, I have not intentionally used any references to Joseph Smith's new translation of the Bible, commonly called the Inspired Version. And the reason why I have not done so is because all the relevant messages, or passages rather, that we're discussing are in the Doctrine and Covenants. And there was no need then to look to the Inspired Version. But are we there yet? Like the little child might ask? I'd say no. The bulk of ministry in the history of the Bible has focused on sacrifice, specifically blood sacrifice, which is ended. The focus in the Book of Mormon as being a judge and church leader, although the Melchizedek high priest is mentioned there. And as I read through the Doctrine and Covenants and the church's history books, I find that almost always the focus in the Doctrine and Covenants, except for the sections I have quoted and a few others, the focus is always an administrative function and duty for the high priest. And so I suggest we're missing something. Perhaps what we're missing is the concept of goal of Zion, which has been quietly showing up at times in the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and the Doctrine and Covenants. It's mentioned over 150 times in the Old Testament, 40 times in the Book of Mormon, 7 times in the New Testament, and over 230 times in the Doctrine and Covenants. That slipped right by us. Of course, it originated as a reference to a mountain or hill and to Jerusalem. The usages refer to a people, a holy city, a center place, a goal. Consider the ministry of Enoch, who is described as a Melchizedek high priest, as we find in D&C 36, which in the Mormons is in the Pearl of Great Price, the Book of Moses, chapter 7, and it was given in 1835. And the Lord called his people Zion because they were of one heart and one mind, and dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. Yeah. 3 spiritual conditions named: one heart and one mind, living in righteousness, and having no poor among you. These have been, throughout the Restoration history, a goal many times in the basis for many attempts in Zionic conditions, We've had businesses, religious organizations, ministerial organizations in Missouri, Utah, and a number of locations elsewhere. Examples could include, say, the Mercantile in Salt Lake City, the Center Stake of Zion, numerous co-ops, the whole concept of the gathering. All of them are imperfect, and vast majority have disappeared or changed purpose. Perhaps, though, we should revisit the New Testament scriptures that we looked at partially before, Romans 12. I quoted verse 1. Now let's look at the whole verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what that good and acceptable and perfect will of God is. This is not a one-time sacrifice. It's a continuing way of life that goes beyond the ordinary. I think this is what was meant as the intent in 1 Peter 2:5, the offering of spiritual sacrifices. So you can ask the question, what does it mean to be a living sacrifice or a spiritual sacrifice? Does it mean maybe to have a broken heart and a contrite spirit? But in this, I think we have the second answer to our second question. What should the ministry of the high priest become today? I think the answer is to lead us to become living spiritual sacrifices. This is much more. It is a willingness to give all we are and all we have to the will of God so that the conditions of Zion can occur. This is not just administrative or a basic office for all the Melchizedek priesthood. And I suggest that perhaps the name Zion is something that we ourselves cannot call ourselves. That has to be a title or a calling or a name bestowed upon us by God. So once again, we have the little child asking, are we there yet? No, but we can get there. Looking now into verses that are not in the LDS Doctrine and Covenants because they're much more recent. In 1947, we have Zionic conditions are no further away nor any closer than the spiritual condition of my people justifies. The foundation of the Lord standeth sure. And again, 1984, the power of this holy priesthood was placed in your midst from the early days of this work for the blessing and salvation of humanity. Now, news war reports bring wars. We're hearing that constantly now. Wars, disease, revolution, environmental collapse, government collapse, and so many more things. I would conclude with these thoughts. Micah 4:1-3 says, in days to come, out of Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. I always found it a little interesting to have the dual mention of Zion and Jerusalem. And as we know from church history, there was a considerable amount of thought that the United States was the original location for the Garden of Eden with 4 rivers. There we've had many other things. We have like the town at one time called Adam on the Ammon. Consider the very early missionary trip to Palestine. I think we were talking about that before this evening's meeting of Orson Pratt, where a prayer was offered there to dedicate the land to the restoration of Israel. And I certainly don't need to mention the severe risks we face with the restoration of Israel, with wars, militarism, increasing polarization in governments, climate problems, etc. Yes, we need the ministry and healing that are from Zion. I have some slides now that are references and resources. The first one is Sharing the Community of Christ, and I give you here where I could access it. And I want to note carefully that many recent changes to the website for the Community of Christ have caused the links that are in print in that book, The Sharing Community of Christ, are all broken. About 80% or 90% of them are broken, and you cannot find them anymore. So do be careful because of that. Robert Greenleaf wrote a good book called The Servant as Leader. And my comment is traditional leadership generally involves the accumulation and exercise of power by the one at the top of the pyramid. In contrast to this, a servant leader focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong. The servant leader shares power and puts the needs of others first. And that is important. There's a master's thesis written by John Lawson when he was studying at Brigham Young University. It's about an 80 or 90 page document, which was interesting reading. He looks carefully at the New Testament, and he then takes a look at the priesthood ministry in D&C 104 or 107, and he interprets from the Melchizedek, and he then makes an interpretation that I think is wrong, that says that the spiritual gifts in the Bible in the Old Testament implied and required the presence of the Melchizedek priesthood. That's an interpretation that is legalistic and ignores the power of God's Spirit to work in ways we don't understand or expect. It also ignores the clear statement that the Melchizedek priesthood was removed after Moses. The Community of Christ has a temple school text for ministry of high priest, typically used for training new people who've been called into that order. The Encyclopedia of the Bible, Priests and High Priests, that I accessed in early this year, has good information about priests and Levites. Halyards, much earlier than me, minister preached a sermon, and you find that in 2 issues of Saints Herald in 1926, June 7th. I had volume and page numbers, and I finally managed to find it in the catalog at the Church of Jesus Christ in their references. But their catalog was a little fun to work with because they didn't have volume and page numbers, and I had to do a lot of searching to find it. But those are the correct locations for where those 2 articles can be found. J.F. Curtis also gave a sermon on priesthood, and again, the same comments about where it can be found. 2 current good, trying to think what I want to say, very well thought about scholars, Warren Carter and Amy Jill Levine. Warren Carter was a instructor for a number of years at the St. Paul School of Theology. I don't remember where Amy is, but he's a Methodist and she is Jewish. And they have written a very good book on the meanings and methods of the New Testament. And I recommend it to anybody who would like to pick it up from a library and study it. And they thoroughly discussed how the book of Hebrews was building its rather powerful discourse about Jesus. Then, of course, we have Strong's New Exhaustive Concordance of the Bible, published back in 1990. There are so many Bible translations today, and any concordance will be complete. But if we start by the New Revised Standard Version, we can then check that verse against other versions and get a more complete understanding of the wording, meaning and intent of the original language. Of course, all this is subject to academic interpretation of obscure words, and there are a lot of those, in the cultural and historical environment, as well as the content of newly found original religious and secular manuscripts from Palestine and so forth. We have, of course, things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, and other scriptures and texts. And finally, I mentioned this one, Bruce Metzger and Murphy, the New Oxford Annotated Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. And I use this version intentionally because of Joseph Smith's revisions found in the Inspired Version. And as I said earlier, almost everything that pertains to the ministry of high priest in the Inspired Version is also found in the D&C. And there's one local member of the Community of Christ who has put together a lot of stuff. That's Stan Tro, and here's a place you can look. It's at scriptures.forthrightsystems.com. He has online copies of the texts. You can search it online, searching for specific words, phrases, and so forth for the Bible, the RLDS version of the, or Community of Christ version of the Doctrine and the Doctrine and Covenants. You can research all of these and many more, as well as many other resources that he has. And well, basically, that's all, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I very much appreciate your research and your presentation. I do want to go back to the question about the high priest as an elevated status versus the high priest as a servant of the people. It appears that we can document the status real well. I'm not so confident in your documenting of the servant of the people. Perhaps you'd hit that again for us, please.
I think I was looking at servant of the people when we were looking at those references and resources when I was talking about the let's see, which one was that? Yeah, Greenleaf's the servant as leader. I don't think that I really was picking much up out of the scriptures about being servant. I think the high priest as a servant, although if you go look carefully in the Book of Mormon, you'll find there's a lot of serving that is being done by the high priest there, especially in Alma. There's a lot of serving that's being done as he was going out and ministering, visiting, and leading, and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I can give you.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I agree that there is some serving in that, but I'm a little concerned that we tend to see the high priest as an elevated status in preference to being the servant of the people. And I'm bothered by that because I think you're right that there's a real need, a real call for it. Let me call everyone's attention to the reactions. Go to the reactions and raise your hand, and I presume Deb will coordinate the people. If you don't find the reactions, wave your hand so Deb can see you and get into the discussion, raise your questions. I claim that privilege for the first question. I did, and so the floor should be open for yours.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Bill, I see you waving your hand, and you were just right before Shane. So Bill Gunlock, go ahead, please, and then Shane.
Who?
Bill, you need to unmute yourself.
I did.
Oh, sorry, I was talking to Bill Gunlock. Did you have a question
Okay.
to Bill Shepherd?
I'm curious about the reorganization. Did they ever have the office of high priest?
Yes. Yes, they do.
We still do.
Okay.
My great grandfather was one.
Okay. Was that it, Bill Shepherd?
Do they have the office at this time?
Yes. The office of high priest is viewed as being the fundamental office for the Melchizedek priesthood, and anybody who is ordained to any other office in the Melchizedek priesthood, uh, specifically uh, the presidency, the bishop, the 12, and also now the 70s. There was a question about the office of 70 being in the high priesthood during Joseph Smith's time. The Doctrine and Covenants in those years did not make that clear one way or the other. And that was a question that was discussed both in the reorganization as well as in the LDS version. And John Lawson looked carefully at that one in his master's thesis as well. But in both traditions, the office of high priest is very much present and very much it is viewed as the fundamental thing. You can have bishops who hold the office of high priest unless they are a lineal descendant of Aaron, when they can be an Aaronic high priest, or rather an Aaronic bishop. You have elders who are described as an appendage to the high priesthood, but they are not high priests. That's all out of the D&C.
Thank you.
Okay. Bill Gunlock, go ahead, and then Shane.
So, what is the difference between a priest and a high priest?
A priest is an Aaronic priesthood office, originally through the tribe of Levi, through the sons of Aaron or the children of Aaron. A high priest is an earlier office which was originated by God to way, way, way back. You have it, if you look carefully, you find it almost all the way to Adam. And it was removed after the time of Moses. It was hinted at in Genesis. I think my reference was Genesis 14, if I'm not mistaken. And then we find it in the Doctrine and Covenants, but more also in the Book of Mormon. And so the Melchizedek office of high priest, that disappeared, but nonetheless, you still had one selected from among all the priests who was voted and chosen to be the high priest in ancient Israel. And that person then was the one who would go into the Holy of Holies once each year to offer the sacrifice for the sins of all the people. Does that answer your question?
Does that hold true for the community of Christ today?
The community of Christ obviously doesn't have sacrifices for sin of blood and so forth, like anything like that. But the community of Christ does have the office of high priest as a Melchizedek office to this day.
And priests.
And priests of the Aaronic order, yes. And they have functions and responsibilities that are generally given in the Doctrine and Covenants, and that those references I don't have in front of me, but they're pretty much in both LDS and RLDS Doctrine and Covenants and history.
Does that answer your question, Bill?
Kind of.
Did you have something further?
No, no.
Okay. Shane, go ahead, please, and then Monty.
Yes, I was wondering if you've ever read David Whitmer's An Address to All Believers in Christ, where he thought that the office of high priest was introduced by Joseph Smith in error, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I have to confess that I have not read his address to all believers. I've heard of it, but I've never read it. That would be an interesting thing to read and consider. Do you have any comments or thoughts regarding that book, since obviously you have read it or know of its contents?
Yes, well, it's actually probably been about over a decade since I'd had read it, but there were others throughout Restoration history, of course, who did believe that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet, and that one of his errors was introducing the office of high priest, since but they believed that that was just for the Old Testament.
Well, that would be a valid way to interpret things, although I disagree with that interpretation, because the office of high priest was introduced way back in 1832, and that's before the time when most people had started raising a question about Joseph being a fallen prophet. I myself had considered a number of times whether he was a fallen prophet, and then looked at the various sections of the D&C and looked at church history to say, well, when did his ministry change? But it was not, it was after 1835, certainly, and we had the high priest office already present by those times.
Okay. Monty, go ahead, please.
I was teasing our high priest Stan Trow one day in the sanctuary because he was giving me a prime example of both the elevation and service of the high priesthood. In that he was changing ceiling light bulbs on top of a very tall step ladder, and so I thought that covered both bases.
Thank you for that.
Unfortunately, we do all too often think of it as an elevated thing. You know, that's really, really big and sacred and everything like this. Yes, there is sacred to it, but let me tell you, the power of God is not something that we can denigrate. We cannot play around with the power of God. I have felt that power once, and let me tell you, that is the only thing. The misuse of the power of God is the only thing that I am afraid of. I'm not afraid of guns, not afraid of knives, war, or anything like that. It's just the misuse and abuse of the power of God, and also of the name that we might claim. So I try to live as a person who follows the teachings of Jesus and let others decide whether I'm a Christian or not.
Bill Gunlock, go ahead.
How do you know when you've graduated from priest to high priest?
In the Mormon tradition, that comes with a certain age and a certain amount of experience. In the RLDS Community of Christ tradition, that comes with a calling that's specific to that person. I would not call it a graduation from one to the other. It's a difference in calling and also responsibility. And all too often, I am afraid of people who hold an office but do not fulfill their responsibility. That's something I would be more concerned about.
Among the LDS, it's changed a little bit recently. It's always been primarily something that happens when one's called into certain leadership callings. So if you become a bishop, a counselor, and a bishopric, a president of a high priest quorum, you tended to be ordained that high priest. It is true that the younger men tended to meet together as elders and the older men as high priests. And sometimes someone who was just got old, they would move up into the high priest quorum just so that they would be, and they would ordain them a high priest so that they could be with that group. But the recent innovation has been everybody meets together in the elders quorum, and the high priest quorum consists only of those who are functioning as bishops or stake presidents, and they meet once a year as a leadership group. So it doesn't have the kind of age stratification that it had before. What you described does describe how it used to be somewhat, although it's always been tied to offices as its primary definer, and then secondarily to age. But now the age part is gone. I don't think anybody will ever be made a high priest again by virtue of their age.
Am I correct in my statement that within the LDS tradition, 70 are all also high priests?
They are at this point. It wasn't always the case. I used to have an uncle who was part of the local 70s quorum. So we used to have 70s quorums in the stakes, and they were primarily tasked with missionary work, and they wouldn't necessarily be a high priest already. So, but then what happened is they changed the supporting office, general officers, from being assistants to the quorum of the 12 to being 70s. They organized multiple 70s quorums, and then the only people who are 70s at this point are either general officers or regional officers of the church. So all of them are high priests by the time they become a regional or general officer of the church. They've already usually gone through being bishops or stake presidents or something, and would be a high priest by virtue of those callings. And then they're called in as a general officer in the church, which would be a 70. If they're not basically apostles and 70s govern the church at this point.
There's a lot of similarities within the community of Christ. You have 70s who are viewed as a secondary missionary quorum. Thank you for your comments. I appreciated them.
Okay, so David Job has shared in the chat box some of the information that is in the seminary course on the high priest. For those of you who want to look at it. High priests are members of the quorum or group of high priests. The primary purpose of the quorum is to provide training, support, and ongoing education for all high priests in the church. The quorum is led by a president, a secretary, and 2 counselors. High priests represent Christ primarily as ministers of vision who model servant leadership and mentor and develop leaders in congregations, mission centers, and communities. High priests especially proclaim and promote the peace of Jesus Christ in congregations and groups of congregations, mission centers, and communities. High priests particularly minister with congregations, mission centers, apostolic fields, and communities, discovering God's call. High priests support sacramental ministries by fostering spiritual growth, and my computer has just locked up, and wholeness in congregations, and preparing them for sacramental experiences, presiding at sacramental services, and performing most sacraments. High priests promote community by building bridges between people, congregations, mission centers, apostolic fields, and ecumenical settings to promote a sense of the broader faith community. High priests promote justice and peacemaking by bridging economic, cultural, social, and theological differences in and among individuals, congregations, mission centers, and communities.
That book is a book that's very worth reading. I have read it myself, but I did not see a way to try to condense it into the brief time of this talk here today.
All right, looks like Cynthia has a question. Go ahead, please, Cynthia.
As a RLDS, raised RLDS, I understood the high priest was to stand in the stead of Christ well, I actually have two statements, and and what you just read answered that to some extent, but it also seems like lately they are more administrative. And so I would like your response to that, standing in the stead of Christ. And the other thing that I think that leads to us thinking of it as a higher calling or a higher position is, it's my understanding that in the Kirtland Temple, the high priest sat at the highest level of the thing. I have never been there. So I think that leads to us thinking that the high priest is a higher status than all the other callings.
Well, we can go back. I brought a slide back up, looking at section 104 or 107 from 1835, and gives the power and authority of these priesthoods, of the Melchizedek priesthood. And those are pretty substantial, awesome responsibilities and callings. Spiritual blessings of the church, receiving the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, having the heavens opened unto them, to commune with the General Assembly, Church of the Firstborn, presence of God the Father and Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant. I spent a few weeks one summer as a young adult as a guide at the Kirtland Temple, and I have good memories of those 12 pulpits and the initials that were on each one. And I thought about even digging up an old photograph of the temple, of those pulpits, but I decided I wasn't going to try to spend all my time looking for a photograph. But yes, we have, throughout much of the DNC and much of the leaders and much of the church, we have focused on callings and administrative and high priests to do this and that and so forth. And I think we have emphasized the administrative to the forgetting of these much more important and higher callings that we should have. And I think we need to achieve those types of ministry if we're going to see the conditions of Zion develop. Thank you, Cindy. I appreciate your comments.
Everybody's kind of quiet.
Let me suggest we go to the open forum where we can see each other.
Okay.
I want to agree with your assertion, because my own observation would be that we have tended to place high priests in positions of administration and responsibilities to do the paperwork. And I'm not confident that correlates very well with the actual call that you've just outlined and highlighted again. And so I am a little bit bothered by it. It seems to me that you're on target in terms of what the scriptures say, but as denominations, I believe we are off target and need to call on our high priest to become more spiritually minded.
Well, who wants to become a living sacrifice? And I don't mean that you're sacrificing your body and your arm, your leg, and so forth, but literally, you are letting God direct everything you do, everything you are. Being willing to give everything you own. Perhaps even saying, I don't own anything, I just am using it, and I will use it for the glory of God, and then searching for ways to use it. Can I claim that I own a car, or should I be ready to give it? That car that I drive that's titled in my name, should I be ready to give it to somebody who has a need? And then how do we discern the validity of the need and what God is calling us specifically to do? That's a big problem. When is God calling us and instructing us to do a specific thing?
Ed Guy was a friend, a marvelous 70 in Latin America.
Yes, I knew him.
Okay, well, because he was assigned a car by the World Church, but I don't know to whom, but he found somebody that needed it more than he did, so he gave the car away and proceeded to walk or ride the bus along with everybody else. He, I think, is an example of what you're saying, one who sacrificed in order to be able to do that, because in that sacrifice, he caught a lot of heat from the administrators who didn't like the idea of him giving his car away.
And he was given money, and he gave the money away almost immediately. Right. Same story.
As you were describing being a living sacrifice and what it meant, everything being sacrificed for God, being totally involved in God's purposes, that was a pretty perfect description of the last covenant LDS make in the temple, which is the covenant to the principle of consecration. And consecration is basically that. And it differs from the law of sacrifice in that the LDS temple covenants, the first one is the law of the Lord, and it's obedience to God just because he's God. It's kind of like a child obeying his parents. The next covenant, main covenant, is the law of sacrifice, which is giving up everything that you have for the sake of the kingdom. The third covenant is the law of the gospel, and it doesn't have any new principles. All it is a new way of being committed to the principles, in that you're not doing it just because God tells you, but because you have embraced the law for yourself. It's now the gospel law. It's written into you. And then the last of the four main ones is the law of sacrifice. It is just the law of consecration, which is nothing but the law of sacrifice again, except that built into the word sacrifice is this sense of loss, that I'm giving something up. I've lost something. And when you go to the law of consecration, it describes better what you just said. If someone is actually living it, we don't feel the loss of something if we've involved ourselves fully in the work and glory of God, which is bringing about the eternal life of other people. God doesn't feel it a sacrifice to do this work, and neither do we if we emulate him. So I honor what you've been doing in your life, because better than most of us, you have been keeping that last covenant in the LDS temple of the law of sacrifice, and you've really beautifully described it. The ideal is there. Whether we live up to it's another question.
I wouldn't say that I have been doing a very good job in my life, but it is something that I wish to establish in my life, and I'm not there yet. But the one about the law, I think the New Testament doesn't say the law is written in your heart.
We love you and appreciate you at Bethel, John.
No, I have said more than once, my desire, when the day comes that I'm no longer alive, I would desire also to no longer own any property, because it has all been given away.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you should understand that you just heard the testimony of someone who is of that highest calling, that of being a member of the community that is building the cause of Zion. I thank you, John, for coming and sharing with us. It's just simply awesome, I think, to see the parallels across the restoration movement. And thank you, Val, for emphasizing, because for us to be able to see the covenant relationships that we have, I think the LDS Church does a better job of coordinating the efforts to get people in larger groups to do things. The Community of Christ tends to leave us much more of an individualistic approach, which I like, but it's appropriate, I think, for us to have our own journeys and to be able to pursue them as effectively as we can. And I appreciate your presentation, John, because you really, I think, highlight a great deal of information that most of us never bothered to look into on the high priest.
Well, I thank everybody here for being willing to share, add their comments, and all that you have been doing in this series of weekly meetings for, what is it, 3+ years now?
Yes.
And so you have been kind to allow me to speak and listen to what I have said, imperfect as it is. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Any other questions, folks?
My wife Nancy would like to say something.
John has a beautiful expression as a teacher. I the way
We need to get Nancy closer to the mic.
He's coming over.
Okay.
I think he has a very beautiful expression as a teacher. Wonderful ability to communicate. Really appreciate your presentation.
Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that.
Okay, I see David Clark, you've got your hand up. Go ahead. Are you there,
You're
David?
muted, David.
Yes. Okay. Yesterday was my birthday, and please, please pray for my mom, who has to take stronger medication for as recovering from an illness.
Okay. Happy birthday, David.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
If you'd like to join me, ladies and gentlemen, at our congregation, when we find out it's somebody's birthday, we sing to them, and it makes a real racket. But yeah, you don't have to stay together, and you can yell as loud as you want. But happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, David. Happy birthday to you. And many more. Isn't that fun? All right. Well, I am intrigued by the prospect that if we could get our high priests to function according to the calling, there are some tremendous powers potential. That one of those early words that you used was keys. And it appears there's quite a lot of unlocking yet to be done. I'm curious what other people would say are the doors that need to be unlocked. How can the high priest would use their keys to help us move in the direction we need to go?
In early church restoration history, the word keys shows up many times in the Doctrine and Covenants. You have the keys of this ministry, you have the keys of this ministry. For example, the priest has the keys of the ministry of angels.
Right.
One time, a member challenged me on that. At that time, I was a priest. And she said, I don't believe in angels. And as she said that, I suddenly was overwhelmed with a knowledge that you cannot describe, that I cannot describe, that God was real, that the ministry was real. And in that knowledge, I said to her, if you wish, I will ask that the Lord send an angel tonight and one will come. And that church member was a little bit taken aback and backed off from that, but I still asked for an angel to come, and one did come. But I learned at that time that when you have that power of God there surrounding you, you better be very careful what you ask for, because if you ask for something that is not, it is not God's will that happened, it will happen and you will be held accountable for the cost of that. So you have to be very careful what you ask for.
I want to say amen, brother.
All right. Go ahead and say it.
I did.
Okay.
But I like John, I had an experience at Singles Reunion right after I was ordained an elder, where we were having administrations, and several were going on. And
clarify, Cynthia, please. Administration, you're referring to laying on of hands for special blessing?
Yes, and as soon as I put my hands on this woman, something came over me that was so profound. I still do not know everything that I said. I do know that I took one hand, and she was so downtrodden and beaten in so many ways, including physically. And the part that I remember was, lift up your head and look beyond the horizon to what God would have you to do. And I don't know what else was said, but it was out of my power.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone in the room, all the other administrations, I guess, stopped, because when I took my hands off her head, everyone was joined physically with their hands and stuff around the room. And the evangelist told me to go back to my room and to take time to rest. And I still don't know what happened at that, but it's an experience I'll never forget.
A blessing was received?
What was that, Paul?
I'm presuming there was a blessing received in the process?
Yes, for the woman that Elaine and I were administering, which was also, since I have had reservations about women in the priesthood, for me, it was also a confirmation that I was called to fulfill a purpose, not just because I was elderly and donating, well, not elderly, but just because I'd been a longtime church member. And as I said, I had had reservations about women in the priesthood. So it was not only an assertion for her, which I was told she was much better at the end of the week because she was incredibly depressed, but that it was a confirmation for me also.
Cool. Thank you, Cynthia. Terry and then Monty. Go ahead, please, Terry.
Going with what Cynthia said, I think it would be a great evening discussion if we just had on miracles like she talked about, in personal miracles. I enjoyed that sort of testimony meeting we had a couple months ago on Book of Mormon. I think a good one on miracles and angels would be a good, great open discussion to have.
One could read Moroni chapter 10 to set that up, because he talks about if we've lost the miracles.
Get closer, Val, please.
Oh, one could read Moroni chapter 10, the last ending Moroni had, to verify that, or his second ending in Moroni chapter 8, 9, both places. He emphasizes that if we don't believe in the miracles and don't have miracles operating amongst us, that we've lost our connection to God and to the Savior. Right. So I think that would be a great thing to talk about those miracles and the way God continues to operate amongst us.
Absolutely.
Well, the fact that we've experienced the miracle with Abigail Barnes coming out of a month of being in a coma, and this Sunday, yesterday, she was at home. She spoke on Zoom to the Shiny Drive congregation saying, "Thank you for your prayers." It was such a beautiful expression of the resurrecting power that is so miraculous to us. And so thank you for the suggestion, Terry. I've written it down, and I agree. I think we do need to put that in the schedule. And I agree that there's plenty of Book of Mormon evidence of miracles that we can cite to begin, but then to spend the evening sharing, I think, is altogether appropriate. So thank you for the suggestion, and Val also for the citation. That it might be that we ought to have. Well, Terry, you want to volunteer to coordinate that one? You're muted.
I was hoping you wouldn't say that, but I don't know if it's fair to turn it down, but I guess I can give it a try.
All right, well, let's target November 6th.
The day before my birthday, I'll do it.
All right. Harry Walker and Miracles. I love it. I came on this evening recognizing that we had a gap on October 2, and Faye Shaw has claimed that one. And now Terry's got November, so we've gone from having a gap to being full out for 2 months almost. So that's great. Monty's got his hand up.
Yeah, I'm like a bad penny. The thing that bothers me is that we see what we call miraculous occurrences, healing that's almost instantaneous, or a healing over a period of time due to prayer and like we did with Abby. But you know, these things we tend to earmark, and if you see a particular minister doing this, you say that guy must be really special to God if he can do this type of thing. I mean, God must be really smiling on this guy because he has the power to heal people. And to me, we have such a tendency to overlook the daily miracles in our life. I mean, the miracle of just waking up in the morning. I mean, that's one thing. But looking around us and appreciating all of the miracles that are around us. It's impossible for our mind to encompass all the miraculous things happening around us. That's one of the reasons why I say it's impossible for any man or woman to behold the whole image of God and remain in the flesh. That type of thing. I may not be stating this very well. My brain doesn't work so pretty well anymore. But I still say it's a miracle every morning when I wake up. But it's just I mean we oh shoot.
Well, let me jump on that one, Monty, because I wanted to take that one back to John as well. The question of the scripture saying, if you look upon the face of God, you could not do that and live.
Well, it's that our bodies aren't capable of it, of conceiving of everything out there. We're limited by our organic brain. And I think it's possible that once we passed on to the next life, that our ability to comprehend and observe is greatly expanded because it's not limited by a physical shell. And of course, there are folks that'll find problems with that too. But I don't claim to be perfect. And but sometimes just the words we say to one another are very healing. And those are the words that the Lord has guided us to say. So the glory's all His, the power's all His. I mean, to say that this man's a powerful minister because he can heal somebody, it is a poor concept. Roy Cheville called it the glossolalia of Christianity, the big outstanding things that people are shocked by. And the very fact that they're shocked shows that they have a lot of growth yet to go through, because if you have faith and absolute faith in the Lord, you're not surprised when something happens. You know, it's just another expression of His work. And it doesn't mean that the person that's being healed is a particularly saintly person. It doesn't, it's not a testimony to just the minister, except for the faith that he has that in the Lord and His ability to do these things. And I just feel sometimes we put way too much emphasis on what we call the special miracles that happen, when we ignore the miracle that just having each other to love, care for, and accept ministry from, and to minister to. I mean, it encompasses so many things, and we're just surrounded by it, become enamored to it, or I mean. Anyway, I think I've blundered enough here.
Well, let me compliment that, Monty. I remember spending one day in which I hurt with every breath I took. And I was so grateful that to be able to finally breathe without pain. It's such a miracle that when our bodies work, then everything works together the way it should, and we are healthy. Being healthy is such a marvelous experience by itself, and it's one that we take for granted so readily. But back to John, I'm anxious, this matter of seeing the face of God. My perception of the divine is well beyond a human face, and so I'm hard pressed to understand that. What's your understanding?
There are no human words that can be used to describe God. The moment I try to use a human word, I have limited what, how, who, where, when God is. We're always going to be limited by the fact that our bodies are limited by the senses we have. So God pours into our mind things we cannot describe. That time that I spoke of an angel visiting a person, that at that moment I felt a reality touch me that was more real, more immediate than anything I can describe or talk about. And yet, having the presence of God and the fullness, as these scriptures are talking about that we looked at tonight, that's calling on some pretty hard to comprehend thoughts. And perhaps it's more like I have experienced this, but there are no words that I can use to describe it to you. But I know it's real. We know things, but we cannot find a way to express them.
Like being out in the middle of the night in a clear sky with stars all around you. I've had the experience where I just laid down and slept that night under the stars, gazing at them, and I really couldn't have described them to anybody else because I'm not an astronomer or anybody who has great knowledge of which stars are which or what's what there, but being able to just see the glory of God in it, in a special way that just hits you so close to the bone that you can't help but respond to it. But it's an experiential thing. It's not something you can describe.
Yes.
I had the privilege of an overnight on the Toporo 3 in the South Pacific. And to be able to ride on the bow of that vessel with huge diesels pushing it through the waves, and the waves, well, the bow would crash down into the water, and I could touch the water as it came up on both sides of the bow, and then it'd be elevated 20 feet up in the air, and then that big vessel would go crashing down, and I felt like I had to hang on to keep from being left up in the air. I mean, just what a neat ride, what a sensation. And then it proved to be quite a contrast that night because I was apprehended because I didn't have a ticket. And I ended up nearly being cast overboard because I was a stowaway. And they took my camera and they took my notebook away from me. And so it was quite an experience. And then under all that tension here, the rain came and it washed through and washed over me. And when I came out of the rain, here I was in this beautiful, clear, clean sky with the Southern Cross clearly evident. And I hadn't had a chance to really examine that before. The passage of the stars across the sky that gave the mariners their orientation every night. Oh, what a beautiful experience to try to identify with them. And then when we finally arrived in Tahiti early in the morning, there was a double rainbow over the island as a seal to what to me had been a most remarkable spiritual experience. And of course, my camera had been stored away. But just simply the experience of appreciating nature in its pristine beauty is one of the real privileges of life that I think is close to the face of God.
Just the Lord ministering to you in the middle of your life of crime.
A few parting comments that I will share. Considering the significance of all the stresses that are present in the world today, the threats of war, threats of violence, poverty, disease, and climate that is falling apart, and so many other things. I think we are in a significant need for some of this ministry that God's Spirit can bring through the ministry of Melchizedek High Priest. We won't necessarily like it. We'll probably disagree with it, not even want to go with it in many times. But that ministry is so critically needed today.
Thank you, John. Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you. Discussion remains open.
Well, I'm going to
Although
say
I think the recording will be shut down.
good night.